that it's no longer considered a theory, but it's scientific fact. And I'm going to go through about 5 of these today, and I'll have to pick up maybe a couple next week, which is typical for my Sunday school class. I'm already going to be behind at the end of this at the end of this session, but if you attend my Sunday school class, you'll know that that's pretty typical. But I'll show you, though, that these evidences have alternative explanations, and we'll go through those. The first one is comparative anatomy. If you look at comparative anatomy, there are similarities of skeletal structures and other organ structures in animals. And it's part of what I do as a job. I'm laboratory animal veterinarian, research animal veterinarian. I review a lot of the protocols that are done at Mayo Clinic. And we want to ensure that the skeletal structures, if an orthopedic project is coming, that it makes sense that that can be compared back to man. And the examples, here we've got a chimpanzee here. There are many similarities in skeletal structures between apes or chimpanzees and man. For instance, and you can look this up in any book, but they have an opposable thumb, fingernails rather than claws, no tail, of course. All the anthropoid apes don't have tails. They have a complete orbit around the eye, and chimps can stand and walk to some degree in an upright position. They of course don't do that all the time. When they want to move somewhere, they get on all fours, but still. There's enough skeletal similarities between chimps and man where they can do that. And from the evolutionary standpoint, why are they similar? Well, from an evolutionary standpoint, they're going to say that's because we have a common ancestor. Now, from a creation perspective, however, we have a common creator. The Creator designed our bodies, designed the chimps' bodies. I'm going to go into this in more detail here in just a few minutes. But remember, we all live on the same planet. And of course the Creator is going to have similarities in skeletal structures because the gravitational force on this planet is the same for all animals. So an intelligent creator, God, designed and created animals with similar anatomical structures because our environments are the same. So it just makes sense on this basis that you can interpret the results, not that we have a common ancestor, but we have a common designer, and that is, of course, God. It's interesting in comparative anatomy, most people don't talk about this. Certainly the evolutionists don't talk about it because it doesn't fit the theory. But there are some exceptions to these similarities that just don't make sense. A few animals lack a gallbladder, just a few. One of them is the Norway rat. And this, of course, is a good-looking albino Norway rat here. Now, there's another animal that doesn't have a gallbladder either. Now, you would think, based on evolution, that it would be one of the so-called myomorph rodents, and these are the 3 myomorph rodents that come to mind for most people. The mouse, the hamster, the golden hamster, and the Mongolian gerbil. We're all, categorized the same or very close to the rat. Any of these, all of them have gallbladders. The animal that doesn't have a gallbladder is the horse. Makes no sense at all. From an evolutionary standpoint, makes no sense. It should, if an animal is going to lose a gallbladder, you would think that very closely related animals would also. This animal isn't closely related on an evolutionary scale at all. It's interesting to be able to remember some of the exceptions sometimes. A second evidence that's going to be listed is comparative physiology. This is similarities not in structure, but how our bodies function. And there are similarities in the cardiovascular system, gastrointestinal system, respiratory system, the immune system, the list goes on and on. And again, this is why animals are used for biomedical research, because there are similarities in physiology, similarities in pathology, similarities in anatomy, where those similarities can be taken advantage of, and we can use those animals and learn more about human disease by using those animals. So that's what biomedical research is all about. So again, the similarities are explained on the evolutionary. From an evolutionist is going to say it's because they're somewhere back in the evolutionary tree there was common ancestors, and that's why there's physiological function similarities. But again, that's not necessarily true. No, from a creationist standpoint, from reading this book, it's a common creator. God designed it. He designed it again for a common environment. Man and animals were created to live on this same earth. So, of course there are similarities. We eat the same types of food when you come right down to it. We breathe the same air, so animals are breathing oxygen just like us. We drink the same water. Obviously, there are physiological similarities because our environments are exactly the same. Another one which has gotten a lot of attention recently is comparative genomics. Now, we know that all living organisms are composed of similar basic chemicals. We talked about last time I was here, we talked about all the amino acids. The amino acids chain together, and they form proteins. And of course, we also talked about the genetic coding system, which is in the cell, which is in the DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid. So we talked about that, and the Human Genome Project, which started in 1990, has put a lot of emphasis on this area of comparison and similarities between humans and animals. They mapped out the human gene, and they sequenced the entire human gene. It took 11 years to do it. They finished that, and the results were published in 2001. They showed many similarities in the genome between animals and man. These genetic similarities are therefore used when you believe in evolution. You believe that those similarities are evidence that everything had a common origin, and there are, again, as they'll argue, common ancestors. Now, it's interesting to look at their data. If you compare human to human, if you compare the people that are here in the audience and you compare us, there is only a 0.1% difference between people. In other words, there's 99.9% homology in our genes. Now that doesn't sound like there's much variation. Keep in mind though, there are 3 billion bases in the sequence, 3 billion. So if you multiply that out, there are quite a few differences. Now, if you look at other animals and compare them back to humans, chimps and bonobos, this chimp on the left, by the way, is a chimp, Pan troglodytes. This is Pan paniscus, which is the so-called pygmy chimp. Most people call them bonobos today. But these two animals are both in Africa, and by the way, these two animals can breed together. So next time I'll get into geographical distribution, but are these animals, in other words, different from when God created them, or are they just different now because of geographical isolation? I would say the second is probably true. But anyway, they took DNA from these animals and compared them to humans, and they have 98.8% homology with the human gene, and which calculates out, of course, to a 1.2% difference. So there's obviously a lot more difference between them, but on the other hand, they're looking for data to claim that we're the same, we have the same origin, and they jump on that right away and say, there's got to be a common ancestor here. Now, if you go to the gorilla and the orangutan, the gorilla is also in Africa with the chimp. And gorillas, there's about a 1.6% difference in humans. And with the Asian ape, the orangutan, there's more difference, and that is not as supposedly as closely related, and it's 3.1% difference. So it's quite a bit more. That's why that they conclude from this that there's an evidence from an evolutionary standpoint again that suggests that humans have a common ancestor with African apes. And this is, all of this stuff has been proposed since the results of this Human Genome Project have been published in 2001. It's interesting if you read, and this is from the actual, this is a quotation here from the Smithsonian Institute's Human Origins Program. And the Human Origins Program, of course, believes in evolution totally. But they've made some interesting statements about the data. Here they say that geneticists have come up with a variety of ways of calculating the percentages, which give different impressions about how similar chimpanzees and humans are. What are they talking about here? Wait a minute, They just said that we were only 1.2% difference. What does that mean? How are these percentages then calculated? Well, this is a long quotation, I realize, but on the other hand, it says that the 1.2% chimp to human distinction involves a measurement of only substitutions in the base building blocks of those genes that chimps and humans share. Well, wait a minute. And then it goes on to say a comparison of the entire genome indicates, and then it says when these differences, when the entire genome is looked at, there is an additional 4 to 5% difference between the human and chimpanzee genomes. Quite a bit different. And it's interesting that, how do you evaluate the data, in other words? However, even with that additional information, the conclusion, still proves evolution in their minds. And it doesn't, from the perspective of this powerful test of kinship, notice the words there, biological kinship. Humans are not only related to great apes, we are one. And that's their conclusion here. Now it's interesting that they used that the test for this was biological kinship. Well, kinship means that we have family ties, that are family ties. That's what kinship is, that there are blood ties between people anyway, and there obviously is a common ancestor. What I'm saying is that they pretty much had their minds made up that evolution was true, and they were going to get the data to prove it without any really, how much difference would it make? It doesn't make any difference. If they would have been 80% similar, I'm sure they would have said, we have a common ancestor, because they're similarities. So rather than proving evolution here, a common ancestor, which would indicate that evolution was true, is assumed to be the only possible conclusion by the analysis of the data. They are not going to look at this data and say, oh, it's not because of a common ancestor, it's because there's a common designer. There's a common God that created everything. It's never going to. It's never going to be one of their alternatives. Never. But again, this data could indicate as well that there is a common creator. If you think about this, we're talking about DNA sequencing here. All geneticists know that the genes code for structure and function. We just talked about anatomy and physiology. The genes, the DNA, is going to determine what you look like, which is anatomy. It's also going to determine how you function. That's physiology. The genes determine that. All geneticists know this. So when God created very similar animals, excuse me, when God created very similar animals, such as chimps and humans, we've already looked at chimps and humans. We know that there are similarities. We are similar. You go to a zoo. I was just at the Denver Zoo just recently, and we saw the chimps. There are similarities. There's no doubt about it. Any geneticist, anyone actually, would expect that the genetic code of those animals, in other words, the DNA, that dictates the phenotype, or what an animal looks like. And keep in mind, the DNA is the genetic code, and it's a very complex recipe, you might say, to produce the animal's body. And when there are similarities, and you see similarities between humans and chimps, you, of course, would expect that their DNA is going to be nearly the same. It's going to be nearly the same because we are so similar. God happened to create chimps, and he created man, and we have a lot of similarities. But that doesn't say anything about origins. So, of course, there would be similarities in the genome. Again, animals and man have the same creator. If you walk out of here without any other information, remember there's a common creator, a designer God who made everything. And he used the same types, he used the same types of materials, and he used the same types of genetics to put everything together. Thus, the basic structure and function of living animals are all the same. So when God created, why would he come up with a totally different genetic model for man as opposed to animals? When we look at the first week in creation here in the next couple of weeks, and we evaluate what God did on all those different days, we'll see that he did create man. He created man, and I'm not saying man's the same as animals. I've got another slide here coming that will obviously not say that. But on the other hand, our bodies and our anatomy and our physiology, we're living on the same planet, so God created us with the same type of genes and genetic code. Of course there are going to be similarities. The point is that these similarities in the sequence of the genome between species don't prove anything about their ancestry or their origins. Again, all life has the same creator. Now, going on from there, another thing that's brought up, this is an interesting one, is embryology. In an animal, after conception, an embryo, of course, develops, and I'm talking about mammals here. And this is when development of the tissues and the organs take place in the uterus of the mother. And in 1866, Haeckel's law was developed. Ernst Haeckel was in Germany. He looked at various embryonic stages of humans and various animals and came up with what was termed the biogenic law. It's the theory that the stages in an animal's embryonic development correspond to the stages of their evolutionary development, which is characteristic of that particular species. And this was one of the things that Darwin, in his book, Origin of Species, predicted would be true. In other words, the developing embryo, as it's developing, retraces its evolutionary development as this developing embryo develops, as in the uterus. The words that were come up with this was ontogeny, which is embryonic development, recapitulates phylogeny or evolutionary development. So as the embryo develops, it goes through the same evolutionary steps and stages. Now I can tell you, no embryologist believes this. None. Zero. No embryologist believes this. And the theory was discredited and rejected very early on. Now remember, 1866. Within just a couple years, the embryologists had thrown this thing out. Totally. They not only rejected it, but found out that these comparisons were done by drawings, and Haeckel actually drew these embryos out, and he actually faked the drawings, misrepresented the stages of the embryos. So he faked the data, in other words. Now, this theory has been totally discredited and rejected. And even in most evolutionary texts, most, not all, it is discussed from a historical perspective. It's not used to try to prove evolution. The reason I'm bringing this up, though, and here it is, you do see it still in some textbooks. And if you go on the internet, you'll find it. You will find this. And in some college campuses, they're still teaching this, and it doesn't appear to me from reading about what they've got listed there that they ever say that the data was faked, even though this has been known for 150 years. The gill slits, you see these so-called gill slits that they are called. And in other words, this human embryo has got gill slits, which would be, similar to the fish, and therefore it's going through a so-called fish stage when it's in the uterus. That's the idea. So these so-called gill slits, which are talked about, still talked about today, by the way. The mammalian embryo develops bars and grooves in the neck. They are not gill slits. They're bars and grooves in the neck. They're actually called pharyngeal arches. They're not remnants of gills from fish. The pharyngeal arches is the correct term. And they develop as the embryo develops into various things, including the mandible, which is, of course, the jaw, the thymus, parathyroid glands, part of the middle ear, and there's some other things in the neck region that they also are developed from them as the animal further develops in the uterus. Now, why am I bringing this up? This theory was totally rejected by embryologists 150 years ago. Even though you can see here a quotation. This quotation is from Dr. Potter, who's at Children's Hospital in Cincinnati, in an article called, "Is the Killing, Abortion of Human Embryos Always Murder?" The answer to that question, by the way, is yes. It is always murder. But look at what he's got here in part of this article. A dictum of developmental biology. A dictum of developmental biology? You've got to be kidding me. A dictum is an authoritative proclamation. That's what dictum means. It's a truism, in other words. A truism, this was thrown out and rejected by every embryologist 150 years ago. It's not a dictum of developmental biology in any way. But it goes on to say, and he even quotes the ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. 150 years it was shown that this was not true. This means that the development of the individual reflects the evolution of its species. The human embryo has a long tail and branchial arches, which are the gill slits or the pharyngeal arches. It first forms a primitive, and then goes on to talk about the kidney, how it's a fish-like kidney, and it's replaced with a mammalian kidney. And then this is all I bolded this and underlined it. Indeed, in many respects, an early human embryo more resembles a fish than a human. Nonsense. This is not true. If your baby that is growing in the uterus is never in the fish stage, never. And but you can see, I should go back. This is not old information. This was written in 2011. It's only a few years ago. This is 150 years after they threw this theory out. Your baby does not have gill slits. It's never in the fish stage. It's a baby from the time that it's conceived. It's a baby when it's developing as an embryo, and he or she is a baby when it's born. It's anything. But you can see that still those people who support abortion are going back and digging up a theory that was rejected 150 years ago to try to justify abortion. And that's why I bring it up here. That's where evolution has brought us. Well, let's go back to the evidences for evolution. Another one is vestigial organs. These are supposedly useless structures or organs that were useful and functional in a previous species or a previous stage of evolutionary development. And in 1893, Robert Wiedersheim published a list, and this is back in the 1800s, of course, over 100 years ago, and the list had 86 human organs and structures on it. 86 that were just useless, carryovers from previous stages of evolution. And in his opinion, they were all vestigial. They were useless. Some of the organs that he had on there were like the thyroid gland. You need your thyroid gland. Your thymus gland, the tonsils. I mean, in other words, there were a lot of organs and structures on there that were parts of the endocrine or the immune system, which back in the 1800s, they didn't understand what was going on. They didn't understand about immune systems and how they defend against disease. They didn't understand about the hormones that we produce in our endocrine system. So they didn't understand all that. So they just said all those organs are all vestigial. No, they're not. They're essential and they're beneficial to the body. The structures on his list, none of them were vestigial. It's just that at that point in time, they didn't have enough information to know. Now, one that's talked about a lot is the veriform appendix in humans. Some of you here may have lost somewhere along the line. You may have your appendix out because you got appendicitis. Here's the appendix coming out of the large intestine right here. This is from Gray's Anatomy text. And this is a cross-section of the microscopic cross-section of the appendix here. Now, it's supposedly a vestige of the cecum, this large blind sac of the large intestine that many animals, but not all, many animals, they have. Now, supposedly this is a vestige of the cecum. Recently it has been found, though, and recently I mean last year, that the appendix, you see here, you can see that this appendix has a lumen in it. There's an epithelium here, and with this lumen, well, they found that beneficial microflora for the GI tract, that the appendix serves as a reservoir for those beneficial microflora. There's a lot of research and some research going on at the clinic right now on microflora of the GI tract, and they're finding all kinds of interesting things out because of it. So in diseases where the gut microflora is altered, when you recover from that disease, the gut can be repopulated with beneficial bacteria, and it's repopulated from the lumen of the appendix. So it's a very important organ in recovery of disease, gastrointestinal disease. And it's also, by the way, you can see these blue areas here. Those contain cells of the immune system. And they, of course, also defend against disease. In other words, the appendix is not a vestigial organ at all. It's beneficial. Sure, you can live without it, but you can live without a lot of things. You can live without a kidney. You can live without your spleen. You can, there's all kinds of things that can be removed from you and you still can live. But on the other hand, that doesn't make it a vestigial organ. The number of vestigial organs right now, I would say, is zero. Zero. We need everything. We need everything. If there's something that we don't need or we don't think we need, there probably isn't enough research to be able to tell us why we do need that, just like the variform appendix. The information on that just came out last year. So even evolutionists, though, have recognized this, that the vestigial organs, they're really function for everything here. And so they changed the definition of the vestigial structure. Now it's not useless. It's not useless, which they used to say, but now it has reduced function. Well, come on now. Reduced function. Reduced from what? Or a new function compared to the organ and its ancestor. It's total speculation here. Total speculation. The last thing I'm going to talk about today is junk DNA. Is this vestigial? I said that the human genome was sequenced, and it was sequenced, as I said, the sequencing ended in 2001. Some interesting things were found. One of them was 8.2% of the DNA is functional. That means over 90% of your DNA supposedly is not functional, and they termed it as junk DNA. In other words, if it's functional, it codes for protein. So in other words, what that means is that it means that there's a section of DNA, a particular section of DNA, and that transcribes to RNA, as I talked about last time we were together, and that produces a protein. Remember, we had the long tape here showing what that protein would take to get a 400-unit protein, amino acid length protein together just by random chance. Now, does that mean that the rest of the genome, and by the way, I should say too that this 8.2% is all over the board. You can find numbers all over. I took one of the more recently quoted numbers, but you'll find this numbers all over the place. Some people say it's only 2%. Some people say it's more than 8%. But anyway, is this junk DNA left over from evolutionary change? In other words, as we evolved, we just carried this DNA from previous animals along with us. And is it unneeded by our bodies? Well, this was speculated to be true in the 1960s. In the 1960s, scientists said, if evolution is true, then we should have a lot of DNA that we just don't need, because how are you going to get rid of it? And it was supposedly then therefore confirmed at the end of the Genome Project in 2001. Now, interesting thing is, though, more recently, when I say more recently, I mean in the last 5 years or so, that this so-called, they changed the name from junk DNA to non-coding DNA. That was the first clue that maybe this stuff, you really do need it. And it's been discovered that to control fundamental gene activity, that which involves thousands, and probably millions of genetic switches which regulate genes. There are so-called promoters and repressors. They're working on this at the clinic right now. You hear, when you read research protocols, you see promoters and repressors in about every other one. I'm not kidding. And they're finding that, as this shows, that the junk DNA theory really belongs in the trash can. There isn't any junk DNA. Now, And it'll say, rather than being inert, the portions of DNA that do not code for proteins, in other words, they are where the controls are for the gene, and they turn on and off and how much protein they make, not only affecting all the cells and organs in our body, but doing so at different times in our lifetime. The key to that is, okay, you've got the controls, for instance, in that embryo in your uterus, in a woman's uterus, that causes an undifferentiated cell to differentiate into nervous tissue, and that to become the brain of the animal. Well, how does all that work? No one knows all the details of that, but now it's suspected that all of that developmental information is in that non-coding part of the DNA. And that's why there's so much of it. It takes a lot to build an embryo from one cell to a fetus in 9 months. It takes a lot of information to put all that together. So, in other words, just like the vestigial organs that you could say, well, they've got the immune system, endocrine system was all listed on that 1800s list. More research is needed to find out what all of this DNA is really for. And my prediction would be that it's going to diminish to the point where scientists will realize that all the DNA we've got is necessary. So, how are the evidence of evolution explained? Well, it's not because we have common ancestors. It's not because there are links and transitional forms. We're going to talk about that next time. But because of a common creative God. That's why. And of course, there are similarities in structure and function, as I've said. All God's creatures, just remember, we're all on the planet Earth. We all have the same environment. We're all breathing the same air, eating the same kinds of food. Of course, there are going to be similarities. And also, keep in mind, God created animals and man with the same genetic code, DNA. He used DNA in humans, he used DNA in animals, he used DNA in plants, actually. So, the genetic model is the same, so of course we're going to find similarities. But as I mentioned before, man is different from all animals. As we'll see when we look at this in the creation week in more detail on day 6, God created man different from the animals. He gave him the image of God. We are different. We're responsible back to this creative God. We have not descended from animals, but we're, as it says there, we're a magnificent, unique creature or creation of God, and we're going to be looking at that more in detail in the coming weeks. Let's close with a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this time that we can gather together in this church, and Lord, although we didn't look at the Bible today, we thank you for your word, and as we look into the first chapters of Genesis and look into your ability to create out of nothing, just be with us as we study that, and we thank you for your creation. We thank you for all the people that are here today. And we just pray that if there's anyone here that has not accepted Christ as their personal Savior, that they will realize that that you as Christ, God himself came here to pay for sin on the cross. And we just pray that if anyone has not accepted that they'll realize that they have to do that today and do that today. We ask and pray all of those things in Jesus' name. Amen.